Hello, everyone, and welcome to part two, our second panel in today's session. Once again, I'd like to thank Shihoko Goto and her colleagues at the Woodrow Wilson Center for partnering with us on this event. We had a terrific discussion from that first panel. Now we're going to move quickly into panel two, where the focus will be on supply chains and related issues. I want to just briefly introduce the panelists, and then I'll have them each speak in turn. Our panelists include Doug Fuller. Douglas Fuller is an associate professor of Asian and International Studies at the Sydney University of Hong Kong and the author of Paper Tigers, Hidden Dragons, Firms, and the Political Economy of China's Technological Development. We also have with us Yeling Tan. Professor Tan is assistant professor of political science at the University of Oregon and the author of Disaggregating China, Inc., State Strategies in the Liberal Economic Order. And we also have with us our own Christopher Miller. Chris Miller is the director of the Eurasia program at FPRI and also assistant professor of international history at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University, and of particular pertinence today, the author of Chip War, The Fight for the World's Most Critical Technology. I'm Jacques Delisle. I'm the director of the Asia program here at the Foreign Policy Research Institute, and I'll be moderating today's panel. Those of you who've been with us in the morning know how this goes, or earlier in the morning know how this goes, but please, if you have questions or comments, put them in the Q&A function rather than the chat function. So since our time is really relatively short, I want to turn it over pretty much immediately to our panelists. I think based on our online discussion a bit earlier today, the sequence that may make most sense is to go first with Doug Fuller, then with Yeling Tan, and then for last comments from Christopher Miller, and then we'll turn it over to a discussion among the group and your questions. So let's start with you, Doug.
Okay, thank you, Jacques, and thank FPRI and the Wilson Center for inviting me today. So I'm going to make relatively brief comments. They actually dovetail well with something that was said at the end of the first panel by Xiaomeng about the fine-tuning of Trump's policies under Biden. What I would argue is that the export controls targeting the tech sector in China, in the first year or so of the Biden administration, there has been this relatively moderate, and I would argue judicious course that, if it continues, is sustainable. So first of all, and some of these developments preceded the Biden administration, but it wasn't at all clear how it would unfold during the Biden administration. But essentially, we see three targeted areas for these export controls. There are those that are military related, those that are human rights, particularly Xinjiang related, and then of course the Huawei connected export controls. And what has been good about keeping these relatively targeted is that it's created a fair amount of predictability within this structure. New firms have been added, or new discovered affiliates of Huawei have been added, but there haven't really been major surprises in terms of changing this overall structure. But I would argue more important for this sort of narrow targeted approach to export controls, as opposed to proposals coming out of certain quarters in the National Security Council or from Congress that would want to broaden these controls more widely, is these narrow controls are much more sustainable. And they're sustainable because they have buy-in from the private sector in the US, they have buy-in from our relevant allies, and frankly, they have buy-in from a lot of private firms in China. I would argue that if we went the route of expanding radically, let's say saying, okay, below a certain level of semiconductor technology, we're not going to sell to any firms in China. This would involve many firms in Japan. It would involve ASML in the Netherlands. And if it was too broad, it wasn't the most cutting edge technologies, these allies, I think, would object vociferously. We've already seen that a bit. I think Jim Schaaf alluded to it in terms of the Japanese sort of preferring monitoring rather than these export bans. Thus far, US pressure to change this, to change the minds of our allies, particularly in East Asia, particularly Korea and Japan, hasn't seemed to yield many results. And our own US firms also might opt to offshore more if we had a broader scope of controls. But most importantly, I think there's a nice united front style tactic here, where the US is also helping to maybe take a little bit of wind out of the sails of China's efforts to have more indigenous technology by offering the choice for Chinese firms. Well, you could spend a lot, get very involved with these efforts with the Chinese government that might not yield anything, or you could, because you're not under these broad export controls, avail of this global technology that's already out there. And the choice for those firms at this point, whether they say so or not, is relatively obvious. And so that also helps maintain the durability of the, frankly, the technological advantage of the US and its allies, and also the ability to have narrow targeted sort of choking points when needed. Thank you.
Thank you, Doug, for that terrific overview of what's a relatively sanguine view of where the supply chain situation is given U.S. export controls, particularly those targeting China. Let's move along to Yeling Tan for her comments.
Thanks very much to Jacques, the FPRI, and the Wilson Center. It's a real pleasure to be here. Let me just quickly share my slides. So can everyone see that? So my remarks today, I'm going to start by talking, zooming out a little bit and talking about the fragmentation of the global trading system, and then talking a little bit about the overall securitization of economic policy in the US and China, and then think about implications for supply chains. So in terms of the global trading system, we can think of it as splintering into broadly what I conceptualize as just three different worlds of trade. In the world of open international rules, we have countries relying on a common set of rules to cooperate and to manage conflict, with the WTO providing the main framework of multilateralism. Now, this system is still in place, but it's been increasingly outpaced by developments in a sovereignty-first world, where countries are unable to cooperate, and instead there are punitive unilateral actions being placed against each other to create barriers to trade. And at the same time, a world of what we might call competing coalitions is also emerging, where you have select group of countries cooperating with each other, but divided by rival spheres. While trade flows and economic cooperation are smooth within the coalition, there's a lot more friction to economic exchange between these competing spheres. Now, since 2016, there have been a lot of developments in the latter two worlds that has very much undermined the post-war system of multilateralism. Now, this is not to say that there's been no action within the WTO and around it, but progress there has tended to focus on very specific issues, such as trade facilitation, fishery subsidies, trade and the environment, and so on. You have a lot more developments occurring in the sovereignty first space. Of course, the trade war between the United States and China, and alongside the tariff escalation, we also have the imposition of export controls, the placement of Huawei on the entity list, broader restrictions that Doug referred to earlier, China's response of its own unreliable entity list, and also China's placement of export restrictions on individual countries such as Australia and Lithuanian exports. The United States has also stepped up investment screenings, not just of inbound investments from Chinese companies, but increasingly also of American outbound investments into Chinese companies. And we might have more restrictions coming through the America Competes Act. And finally, in terms of competing coalitions, we see efforts to pull countries into various rival spheres. So in response to the fears of the geopolitical impacts of the Belt and Road Initiative, we have the US response of a Build Back Better World initiative. That to a certain extent overlaps with the, at the moment, rather vaguely defined Indo-Pacific economic framework, which is framed around the idea of building coalitions to counter challenges created by a rising China. This is on top of restrictions, efforts by the US to exclude Chinese telecommunication equipment makers from 5G networks. Layered on top of that, we have the clause in the renegotiated NAFTA to potentially terminate the USMCA if a partner signs an FTA with a quote unquote non-market economy, the NME clause. And we also have the US-EU Trade and Technology Council, which is focused on a broad range of issues, but also includes on the agenda this desire to come up with a common approach on contentious issues that are related to China. So driving much of this splintering of the trading system that I've just outlined is also a rise of security concerns over economic interdependence. In the United States, we see this with the Section 232 investigations launched by the Trump administration, the Biden administration's Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which mentions the word security 26 times in a 15-page document. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen's speech at the Atlantic Council last month reaffirmed this securitization by stating that US policy should be to achieve, quote, free but secure trade and to adopt, quote, friend shoring of supply chains. And then we also have accompanying legislation in Congress as well. Now, this securitization has been very much paralleled in China. Xi Jinping's speech delivered at the release of the 14th five-year plan last spring mentioned the word security 17 times, which was up from 5 times from the 13th five-year plan. And in that speech, he notably emphasized this close linkage between security and economic development, stating that security is a prerequisite for development and development is a guarantee of security. And more recently at the Boao Forum, he expanded this link globally with the announcement of a global security initiative, wherein he reiterated that security is the precondition for development. And we also have in Japan an economic security bill aimed at enhancing supply chain security, among other issues. So with these macro developments, what are the implications for supply chains? Well, there's obviously been a loss of predictability to some degree for firms and consumers, and increased concerns over supply chain resilience and security. But here I'd like to point out that we need to distinguish between the implications and the needs for resilience versus security. The two are very much different concepts. So many of the recent disruptions in supply chains that we've seen in the news and affecting all of our lives so far, created by the pandemic, have increased concerns over resilience. But stronger resilience implies a greater ease of substitutability so that you can always switch to a different supplier in case of a disruption. This means being able to source both domestically as well as internationally, because you never know which place is going to experience a lockdown or have some other kind of workplace or production-based disruption. So it might mean a diversification of suppliers to reduce reliance on China, but not a total exit from China. So to increase supply chain resilience, we might see firms and governments seeking to reconfigure their supplier networks, but not to decouple from China. Now, US-China economic tensions, on the other hand, have been much more centered on security concerns. And this is where we might see greater concerns over decoupling But as Doug mentioned, it's in very, very highly targeted areas and in very specific goods such as semiconductors rather than trade networks more broadly. And in fact, when we look at China's response to US export restrictions to increase its own self-reliance in chip manufacturing and supply, it's actually likely to reduce its supply chain resilience and increase vulnerability in the sense that it's restricting its alternative supplies are being restricted. A larger question we might think about is how effective these efforts are going to be, because they cut against very deeply nested supply chains in Asia. A more medium-term problem is that as we see governments around the world channel more subsidies towards strengthening their own domestic chip production, we might end up with a situation of excess capacity. And there are other areas of uncertainty as well, such as whether or not these policy moves in the US and China will erode some of the trade creating potential of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or the RCEP, and also whether how it might impact China's application to join the CPTPP. So I'm going to stop there and turn it over to the next speaker.
Okay, thank you, Yaling, for adding to that, broadening our picture a little bit on some of these issues. And now for our final set of opening remarks, we'll turn to Chris Miller, and then we'll get to talking among ourselves. Go ahead, Chris.
Well, great. Well, thank you, Jacques, and thanks to my two fellow panelists for kicking off the discussion by putting a bunch of great ideas on the table, most of which I agree with. So I struggle to follow them and say something new, but I'll try to provoke with a couple of thoughts. I think first is that I, on a daily basis, read in the newspaper about supply chain crises. And I think we ought to be extraordinarily skeptical that there are supply chain crises, at least in any sort of generalizable sense. And I think this sense of crisis certainly motivates discussion and, to a lesser extent, action in Washington without much clarity on, well, what exactly is the problem that we're trying to solve. Certainly, supply chains for many goods over the past year and a half have seen some delays. I've seen increase in prices. I've seen certain components be unavailable at the expected price and delivery date. But I think actually the main story of international supply chains that are providing manufactured goods is one of extraordinary success. In the US, for example, consumption is up by over 10% compared to pre-pandemic levels, largely driven by consumption of manufactured goods, many of which are imported from abroad. And our supply chains have, broadly speaking, with some price increases, but without drastic price increases, supplied these goods. And I think in the semiconductor industry in particular, which is where both of my two fellow co-panelists have devoted some of their attention, the striking story of the past 2 years is not that there have been occasional delays to certain chips, but that in both years of the pandemic, despite massive shutdowns worldwide, despite huge disruptions to working patterns, we produced vastly more chips each year than the previous year. Which to me suggests a international supply chain, not an international supply chain crisis, but rather an extraordinary example of international supply chains doing exactly what they're supposed to do, supplying the goods we need relatively on time and at reasonable price. And I think if you'd asked someone in 2019, what do you think the likelihood is that we're going to both have a disastrous pandemic and produce 10% more chips the subsequent year, most people would have said that's an implausible thing to accept. That's exactly what we've done in 2020 and then again in 2021. So I think we should take descriptions of supply chain crises with a substantial grain of salt and ask what really is the crisis we're trying to address, because I think actually the story in most cases is not of the system failing, but rather of the system working. And I do have some concern that our efforts to address non-existent problems will actually create real problems while failing to address the supposed problems they're trying to fix. So rather than, I think, looking at supply chain problems or alleged supply chain problems in the context of the macroeconomy or in the context of increase in prices of specific goods or delays of specific other goods, I think the way we ought to think about supply chain risks is rather what were to happen if things were to get really bad and there were to be a conflict of the type we're seeing between Russia and Ukraine right now in East Asia. Because the reality is that the past 2 years, if they've shown anything, have shown that supply chains can deal with basically any peacetime disruption we throw at them. And the risk that I think we ought to think harder about is what happens if the assumption of peacetime breaks down. Now, that's certainly a small risk. We can debate whether it's a 1% risk or a 5% risk or a 10% risk over the next decade, but it's not a 0% risk. And I think the cost of such a risk materializing would be extraordinarily large, measured in the trillions of dollars rather than in the millions or billions. And so when I think about supply chain risks that I'm worried about, rather than I think largely non-existent supply chain problems or crises today, I think we ought to be thinking about worst case scenarios and what, if anything, we can do to mitigate them. And I think wartime scenarios are, in fact, the scenarios that we ought to be thinking about. And I think to many people, 2 months ago, that would have seemed like a far too pessimistic way to think about supply chain risks. But I'm afraid that I think the past 2 months, if they've shown anything, have shown that we can't rule out these tail scenarios. And indeed, they're the scenarios that most necessitate our planning right now. So I would like to encourage the supply chain discussion in general to think less about minor issues today that firms will have no difficulty sorting out in due time, and thinking more about what are the risk scenarios in which some amount of governmental involvement will be crucial, simply because the magnitudes of disruption will be so large and because militaries will be involved. And those are the really hard supply chain questions, which is why I think so often in Washington discussion turns to easier supply chain issues that I think our existing supply chain management processes and corporations will have no difficulty in sorting out. So I'll pause there, but I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Well, thank you all. Thank you all for a very rich discussion and for doing a wonderful job of keeping to time. So we do have some opportunity here to take some questions from the audience as well as to discuss these matters among ourselves. I want to pick up with a slightly less dire version of the scenario that Chris just put on the table for us, which is, granted that we do have the prospect of actual conflict does have the virtue of focusing the mind, but I wonder what you think of the broader lessons, the perhaps less extreme scenario lessons that might come out of Ukraine. All of you have talked about, in the prior panel, talked about the US-China frictions in this area. To what extent does the kind of sanctioning we've seen visited on Russia coming out of Ukraine make people in China think, hey, maybe we need to start hedging against these kinds of possibilities well short of war, or to at least put us in a position where we could pursue war over a Taiwan scenario or some other thing, to mitigate that risk in a forward-looking way could be somewhat disruptive. How big a concern is that? I'll throw that to any one of you, I guess, to Chris first, but I welcome anyone.
Sure, I'm happy to take a stab at it, but others might have better answers than me. I don't think I've seen any evidence yet thus far on how the Chinese policy process is going to adjust to whatever lessons they've drawn. And perhaps that's not surprising since we're only in week 8 of the war. So I think the lesson drawing process will come in due time, but I struggle to imagine that the conclusion wouldn't be, here are some real risks we need to deal with more seriously. That said, I think if you look at how the Chinese political process, as opposed to the Chinese corporate universe, the Chinese political process has always treated reliance on foreign supply chains as a risk. And you see this very clearly in policy statements going back not just years, but really decades. The question is really the balance of influence of people who are concerned about the security ramifications in the more policy-oriented part of the Chinese elite versus those who are making money with international connections, the more business-oriented part of the elite. It seems plausible to me that the war between Russia and Ukraine, the international sanctions that have followed, will shift that debate somewhat towards those who are more focused on the security ramifications. But I don't know that we've seen any sort of drastic moves or even statements of intent to move from China thus far.
Although we may be in a somewhat more protracted moment in China where the entrepreneurs and the businesses' wings are being trimmed a little bit. We've sort of seen the regulatory storm over the summer, and a few high-profile folks, Jack Ma and others, that face a reading of the Political Riot Act, as it were. Yeling or Doug, do you want to weigh in on this point? I think
I was muted. Sorry.
With Yeling and then Doug. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Thanks. I think the scenarios are very different for both the U.S. and China. On the China side, there's no doubt that there's been the crisis in Ukraine has sparked a reflection, a series of rethinking within China on implications and what to do with their dependence on the dollar. And so I can't remember when it was, but recently I think the PBOC did hold a meeting with a bunch of institutional investors to kind of talk through options available to the Chinese government, and it was revealing in as far as the reporting went, that there aren't that many options for the Chinese government. You know, there might be some sort of limited options for them to increase dollar deposits that are held in the mainland as opposed to offshore. And some other sort of more tweaks around the edges, but the nature of China's very deeply woven involvement in the international economy means that it can't really diversify from its dependence on the dollar very much. But at the same time, right, the same interdependence holds for the United States. So if it tried to impose similar types of sanctions, the consequences would ripple through the global economy and through the US economy in a far more disruptive way compared to the disruptions that have already happened in terms of energy markets and agriculture markets in the Ukraine conflict. So I think that in a sense, we can think of as tying the hands of the United States as well.
Yeah, I think it's an important point to make to our audience here, that projections from the Russia-Ukraine scenario to a U.S.-China scenario hard to do, because just the scale in both directions, the leverage each side has on the other, and the destruction it would wreak is orders of magnitude larger than what we see happening with Russia, which is largely exporting commoditized energy products, and which is not a major market for any of the actors whose exports are being restricted, certainly compared to China. Doug?
Yeah, I was just going to comment. I mean, I generally agree that there's been this long techno-nationalist tenor to China's policy thinking. And I mean, I would go actually further than Chris. I don't think the people who really are in it just to make money are really allowed to. That's sort of taboo. You can't spin it that way. There's also, and I also think there's another group, there's sort of the insiders who are just using this appeal to indigenization to make money through state-owned firms or whatever they're doing. So there's but they're also ultimately pushing this policy, successful or not, towards an indigenization direction. And I mean, to just go further on this scenario of what, I don't even think it would have to be war necessarily. I mean, I don't know necessarily why China would want to do this in a fit of pique or something, but it'd be trivially easy for China to damage all of Taiwan's advanced fabrication facilities with missiles, not launch a war to take over Taiwan, do this very quickly if they chose to. That would be quite disruptive internationally, unless we actually do change the international, non-Taiwanese international fabrication capacity. So there are even scenarios short of war, really, that could be quite disruptive.
And further back on that spectrum, blockades of various sorts could impede the shipment. So we have a couple of questions in the chat that I think I'll synthesize a little bit here. They basically raise the concern about the attempt to build supply chain security and or supply chain resilience, perhaps heading down a path of autarky and hoarding and trying to lock down supplies in ways that really could spiral badly. Do you see risks of that? I mean, Doug, you spoke about how narrowly targeted U.S. export restrictions have, and Chris has been talking about a relatively sanguine story, short of the worst case scenarios. Yelling had a somewhat more mixed picture of where the world looks. But what's your sense? Do we have to worry about that? And if we do, what are the sectors that are supply chain relevant that are most vulnerable to this attempt to lock down supplies and perhaps hoard and cut off others?
It was mentioned in the first panel, and obviously a lot of upstream materials that then go into whether it's green energy products or various electronics. That would be an area that would seem susceptible to this kind of attempt to hoard, just because there's not, the supply right now is quite concentrated in some rare earths, for example. So, and getting up to speed, new facilities or new sources is going to take some time.
Okay. Anyone else want to weigh in on that?
Well, I would say, please go ahead.
I play traffic cop. Chris and then Yilling.
Okay. I would say in certain commodities, I think we already see some evidence of what you might call hoarding going on. If you look, for example, at gas storage, countries across the world are pouring gas into storage on fears of future, this is natural gas, and fears of future supply disruption. And Europe is case in point. Europeans are deeply afraid the Russians might cut off Russian natural gas supplies, and so are right now trying to fill up their stocks while they can. And I think you wouldn't have thought of Europe to be a likely hoarder of crucial commodity if you'd projected forward a couple months ago. But in fact, this is having repercussions across the world because they're impacting liquefied natural gas prices basically everywhere. I suspect this is going to be a problem we're going to face more and more as all of the key powers take more steps to politicize their supply chains and politicize their production and control over raw materials. It's sort of a natural effect of these types of moves. We've also heard anecdotally, I think, I don't know if we've seen good evidence, but anecdotally, Chinese firms stockpiling or hoarding, you might say, semiconductors and fears of being cut off, or in terms of actually dealing with being cut off in the case of companies like Huawei. And this is, again, a very rational strategy. If you think you might be next in the list, hoarding makes perfect sense.
Thank you. Yilling?
And I would add to that the hoarding of vaccines and vaccine raw materials in early last year. Export controls placed by the United States to ensure a secure vaccine supply within its country, but obviously that situation has since lifted. So we see, like various countries trying to stockpile, at least in the short term. But in the longer term, I don't think we're moving towards any sort of stark forms of autarky. I think the more likely scenario is this concept of friend shoring, right, where we see supply chains being reconfigured for critical materials to sort of ensure that there are still overseas sources, but from trusted, partners, or depending on your definition of who's trusted and who's not.
So one of the things that we used to hear in discussions of China's changing role in global value chains and global supply chains was that some of the concerns that have become stark now with COVID and with the securitization, as it were, of these economic concerns, some of those, there was an argument that we were going to get there anyway. That is that just by evolution of cost curves and the development of of other countries in South and Southeast Asia that would be able to supply some of these things. We'd go there for reasons short of the dire scenarios we're talking about now. Is that dynamic still there? If so, is it powerful enough to provide some kind of exogenous or I guess actually more endogenous, is sort of built into the nature of the economic system, push in the direction that we're now seeing policy pushes for resilience or security reasons? I guess I'll start with Doug on that one if he wants to weigh in.
I'm sorry, I'm not entirely clear on this question. Maybe because it's so late at night here, but
just say that we used to hear that when people were worried about everything being sourced in China and the dependence that brought, before we worried about COVID disruptions, political disruptions, all that sort of stuff. The happy story was, well, people are going to want to diversify anyway because there are cheaper producers, reliable producers, diversification done for purely economic reasons, short of the kind of disruptive scenarios that I think led to our panel today.
Right. I mean, I think some of that has already happened, at least prior to COVID, and probably will continue to happen. But I think the areas that the United States, or let's say Japan, are most concerned about are in higher value added or more technology intensive things that aren't probably going to end up in the Philippines or Vietnam anytime soon. And so that's really fueling a lot more of the supply chain security concerns, rather than who exactly is going to assemble the smartphone.
Fair enough. So some of the more raw material type things may raise greater concerns and components. Yading or Chris, do you want to weigh in on this?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right that some of these movements out of China were already happening for cost reasons. What's interesting is that some of the firms that moved to places in Southeast Asia then moved back to China when they found that they could not quite replicate the conditions within mainland China. And I think that is something we do need to dwell on a little bit, because the types of supply chains and the type of production that you're able to get in places like Shenzhen are very, very difficult to replicate in a separate country. In places like Shenzhen, you can prototype a phone within a few days, change its design, and modify various features very, very quickly, because all of the firms that you need to talk to from the design to the construction are all there. Is it possible to replicate that kind of ecosystem in Vietnam? I think it's very, very difficult. And so I think that's why you still see a lot of multinational firms still placing big bets on China. They can't completely diversify away from China, and they don't want to either. I think FDI flows into China is still very, very strong. Some of it, I mean, the content of the FDI might have changed a little bit, but a lot of firms are still moving into China because of the size of the Chinese market, and because for some of the more downstream, higher value added products, it's very hard to replicate outside of China.
Could I respond briefly to that? I mean, there is this argument that people make, but I think it's not actually taking a good account, since you mentioned smartphones, of these particular supply chains. I think it's true if you're a relatively small Chinese producer of such goods, then you're much more dependent on this external ecosystem in China. But if you're Samsung, boom, they were able to move everything to Vietnam. It used to be in Huizhou, right next to Shenzhen, no problem. If you're Foxconn or Quanta, or one of other these big Taiwanese firms that has this whole supply chain that will just go with them, it's really not going to be that hard. And their choices in China with the rapidly changing demographics are either robot up, which might happen, or go to some other place where there's a lot of bodies for cheap. And I just don't, Yes, there's FDI in China coming in, but I think the mix has rapidly, at least pre-COVID, was rapidly changing. And I'm looking at export platforms. Sorry, Chris. I mean, the people who are coming for the China market, well, I can't argue with that. I think that's a different set of firms typically. Sorry.
I think the great test case of that, Doug, is if you look at Foxconn or Wistron in India, and to assess how quickly or not they ramp up their operations in a country like India, which have been plagued by some labor issues, as I understand, the past couple of years. But if they do expand that would seem to suggest they have confidence in alternative markets. If not, then perhaps not.
I mean, I think for very particular reasons, labor-related reasons in India, it's always it's going to be a tougher haul there. That's why I think there's places in Southeast Asia, or maybe even frankly Bangladesh, that might be better suited. But if they were able to solve these, how to deal with the labor conundrums in India, where the formal sector is so heavily protected, if they could solve that, then watch out, because there's a lot of low-paid wage laborers in India that they could utilize.
Okay, we spent a minute or two there on India. I want to swing to the other side of mainland China. We've been talking semiconductors, of course, to a significant degree, and Doug raised the prospect, and Chris raised the prospect as well, of action that might take out Taiwan's capacity. So we've got a couple of questions that get to this issue. So what are your thoughts on the Taiwan and particularly the TSMC issue in this? Obviously a hugely important producer, but caught in the middle in a few interesting ways, right? At risk of being hamstrung by U.S. constraints because of its market in China, vulnerable perhaps to disruption by China. How do we manage the TSMC problem? That is to say, figure out how secure its supply is, how to insulate it from disruptions, and therefore us from those disruptions, and its function as in some ways perhaps a substitute for China, although obviously it operates in a somewhat different niche. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I've always thought the argument that Taiwan's fabs would somehow protect it from attack from China, but the Chinese side would be unwilling to attack, is not very convincing, because if they were willing to go down that route anyway, I mean, I don't think they'd be really that concerned about. They would be planning for an immense amount of disruption anyway. So on that side, I don't really buy it. I mean, from the U.S. side, that argument's been around for over 20 years. I mean, the Pentagon was making that argument in the late 1990s that another reason we have to protect Taiwan is because of the semiconductor industry. But obviously, we're in a very different military situation in the Taiwan Strait now. So arguably, it would be best for the U.S. to use its resources to build up alternative capacity in the U.S., because it's not really clear. It would be hard for China to take over Taiwan, but even in a failed attempt or some other military maneuver, they could easily heavily disrupt that industry, and there's not that much the U.S. could do about that.
Yeah.
I mean, I think one question I have, just responding to what Doug said earlier, is, if it were feasible to create another TSMC outside of Taiwan, surely it would have been done by now. So I'm actually kind of interested in what Doug and Chris have to say about the possibility that was raised, which is that the U.S. should create its own alternative source. Is that a feasible short-term or medium-term plan, or is that really just a long-term, something that can be achieved only?
Well, we're not talking about ancient history. I mean, TSMC being the company with the most advanced nodes is really, a very recent phenomenon. And there certainly has, and very easily could be, once again, advanced production in the United States, whether it's TSMC or Intel. Samsung, what was it, 5 years ago? Where was their most advanced production? It was in Austin, Texas. It was a fab. So my answer to that is yes, right now at this moment in time, Taiwan has, the most, the largest capacity at the most advanced nodes, but I don't think it's insurmountable to these other companies, or, the US is also pursuing this alternative of adding more TSMC capacity in the US. They have some older fabs in Oregon, but the plant in Arizona.
Well, so the last comment on this topic goes to the author of Chip Wars. Chris?
Well, yeah, I agree with most of what Doug said. I think in addition to the question of will Taiwan long have the leading technology, there's also the question of production capacity. Because I think even if you assume that Intel is going to catch up with Taiwan in terms of technology, which is totally possible, as Doug says, there's still just an irreplaceable amount of production capacity in Taiwan that we just can't make up in anything measured less than decades. Just given the amount of tooling that's there, the difficulty of producing new quantities. So I think that does make Taiwan not irreplaceable, but very, very, very expensive to replace. I think if you ask yourself, what's the most cost-effective way of preventing military escalation scenarios from causing problems to chip supply chains, the answer is the most cost-effective way is to spend money upgrading U.S. military capabilities in and around the Taiwan Straits. Because the reality is that building advanced fabrication is so expensive. I think you're probably better off investing more in capabilities to deter the Chinese from trying something. Doug, you want to jump in?
You're not, you're discounting all the positive externalities that may occur from the business activity behind the investments. Not to mention a lot of the equipment that goes into those fabs will be made in the US. Whereas a lot of military equipment, I say it as a sad shareholder of some defense contractors, is basically a deadweight loss economically. So I would pretty strongly push back against that, even though I agree with you, it would take a long time to replace all that capacity. It will take even longer if we don't do anything.
if your calculus is simply moving the chip industry versus buying additional military capability, perhaps there's an argument to be had. I think if your calculus is if you have a war in the Taiwan Straits, it's not just the chip industry, it's the entire consumer electronics industry that's disrupted for a very, very long time. And some of that's more movable than other parts. But the reality is we're talking about years to put supply chains back together again. And that's why I think the cost of any sort of escalation scenario in the next decade would be measured in the trillions. And based on, in comparison to those types of numbers, I don't think tens of billions in additional military spending focused on the region is at all an unreasonable thing to ask for.
I doubt the trillions. I would add that, there is a lot of know-how in the wider electronics industry that's not just buried on both sides of the Taiwan Strait. There's still these, frankly, a lot of U.S. contract manufacturers who have plants around the world. So, there would be a high cost, but I'm a little bit hesitant about this super high number.
Well, I don't know. If you look at production capacity, a third of logic chips by value are produced in Taiwan. Just getting the tools you would need to replicate that somewhere else, given that tool makers are now currently booked out through into 2024, that's a really tall order, and if an emergency were to happen.
So this is a terrific discussion, and it shows the virtue of having people who really know this field engage on it. But I don't want to get too far down that pathway, lest we run out of time to get some other questions. I would just add before we get, not to get too far into the military stuff. Of course, some of those military investments are already there, right? It's a matter of getting allies to commit their weaponry and getting Taiwan to invest in useful systems of deterrence rather than high-profile, expensive, but not terribly useful ones. I want to turn to Yeling with the next question. We got a couple questions that essentially get at what are the collateral damages that can flow from some of the attempts to build resilience or security. And one of our questioners asked, does this get in the way? Does this sort of mentality of competition and security and resilience get in the way, perhaps, of cooperating on other issues we need to cooperate on? Things like climate change or global public health, or even other aspects of international economic relations?
Sure. So one thing that concerns me is sort of I don't know if conflation is the right word, but to link broad general security concerns as being solely a China problem, right? And we see that type of thinking manifesting in particular in the 5G debate, and I think that creates some vulnerabilities as well, because the vulnerabilities of 5G networks are sort of a byproduct of the way it's structured, which means that it's vulnerable to attack from any sort of hostile force, not just the Chinese one. So by channeling political and economic energies towards countering what's been framed as a China threat, what are the vulnerabilities that the American government might be overlooking by sort of putting all the resources in one direction? What are the blind spots that have been created? And I agree that also creates a problem for the United States government in terms of the areas of cooperation that it does want to push forward in climate change and so on. So we've seen the Biden administration try to put out the argument on both fronts that yes, it wants to cooperate with China on things like climate change. At the same time, it's pushing all of these initiatives to strengthen its partnerships and allies around this broader strategy of countering the challenges that they see coming from China. And I don't think that strategy, that dual message is being bought very much by the Chinese government. It's still interpreting the overall shift in the broader geopolitical environment as one that has turned hostile against them, and many of these initiatives as trying to constrain and curb its rise. And so to me, it's not a very effective strategy.
And indeed, we've seen in one of the more recent examples, China's reaction to USICA, right? Although in many ways it is a smaller version of what we've seen as industrial policy under Xi Jinping and sort of pushing the cutting edge sectors, and there's a lot of other stuff in it too. But the pushback was this is a Cold War mentality. It's tempting to disrupt global economic integration. So clearly the temperature is very high on these things. I guess Doug and then Chris on this, if you want to weigh in.
Yeah, I guess I'm rather skeptical that it's good that Biden says that we're sort of two-tracking, that we're pursuing some cooperation as well as some competition. But I'm rather skeptical that if the US, dropped what China perceives as the hostile actions, that we would get a lot more cooperation on climate or these other issues. China's doing what China does because it's in China's interest too. And frankly, Xi Jinping is a true Leninist. If the US started playing nice again, would just probably think, oh, they're really in dire straits. It's their last leg. They're on their last legs. They're just doing this because they're weak. So I am deeply skeptical at this point that we're going to elicit more cooperation on those fronts, frankly.
Chris?
I think I generally agree with Doug. I mean, I think no one dislikes international cooperation, but I guess when I think of when I think of public health challenges, when I think of climate, most of the action that's needed is action domestically, including within the U.S. and within China, rather than international cooperation. Not that it's a bad thing, but I think it's often not as decisive as one might think. And so in that sense, I think I'm with Doug that we shouldn't expect whatever happens with the U.S.-China relationship over the coming years, we shouldn't expect that to herald large changes to these other challenges that wouldn't otherwise have happened, even without a shift in the U.S.-China relationship.
Okay, we have another question in the chat I want to get to before we run out of time here, which is we talked a lot about the supply chain for various products, and the questioner says the solution to supply chain disruption seems to be diversifying supply and increasing resilience, but the solution to cybersecurity, that's about the cybersecurity angle, seems more challenging. Does the U.S. need to completely remove China and other adversaries or potential adversaries from tech supply chains? Is the cybersecurity threat of sourcing tech from China and other such places a priority or an overstated threat? How should the U.S. and its allies approach these issues? So I think, Yelling, you spoke to this a little bit when you talked about Huawei and the broadband issues. So do you want to take up this issue? When we're talking about tech components that have this cyber vulnerability, do we need to think about it differently than other kinds of supply chains?
Yeah, I mean, the security problems and concerns, I think, are real, and all countries have been trying to sort of puzzle through how best to deal with it. I mean, we see the U.S. is not alone in thinking about cybersecurity. I mean, China is thinking also about cybersecurity, right, in response to some of the Snowden leaks from 2013, 2014. You see from then on a real effort by the Chinese government to sort of strengthen its cybersecurity apparatus and sort of overcome some of the domestic fragmentation around who was in charge of cybersecurity. And so in that sense, I think the problem is a global one, really, and a very different proposition altogether from how to build resilience, right? So if you want to combine resilience with security, I think that goes back to what the US, I think, is trying to push now in terms of this concept of friendshoring, right? So again, we're not moving necessarily towards an autarkic world, but these competing coalitions where countries are trying to ensure that they're still economically integrated, but when it comes to sort of critical infrastructure, that vulnerabilities are insulated by partnering more with what they define as trusted partners.
Okay. Chris?
When I think of the cyber risks that I'm most concerned about, I tend to think that we ought to, and we already do, devote a lot more focus to software rather than hardware concerns. If you think about where we've faced the most disruptive hacks in recent years, it's been largely due to software issues that have been exploited rather than hardware. There's some exceptions to that, but that's certainly the track record of recent years. And so in some ways, I think the cybersecurity problem is mostly a problem of getting the right software and updating your software rather than hardware. For certain military systems, I think there's more reason to be a lot more focused. But thus far, I don't think we've got a lot of great data points that show widespread consumer vulnerability to hardware.
Okay, Doug, you get the last word on this topic and nearly the last word for our session.
Okay. I mean, I basically agree with what Chris said. We certainly don't want to go down the route of worrying too much about hacking of individual consumers' phones. But I would say, I mean, some of the supposedly secure suppliers to the US military that we have in Taiwan, I have heard from reliable sources themselves are illegally sourcing components from China. Probably doesn't matter. They're just doing it because they're cheaper. But there are, even our secure suppliers are not foolproof.
Okay, we're just about up against time here, so I'm going to ask for real quick reactions from each of you, like a sentence or so on each of these, on this question. So CPTPP was touched upon earlier. Is it helpful in terms of the kinds of issues we're talking about here, and will China and or Taiwan get in the near future? Let's just go round the horn here. Doug, Chris, and then Yele.
I would be surprised if China gets in. Taiwan may be slightly less surprised. The politics around that are quite tricky because of China's reaction. I don't know if it really then somehow resolves U.S.-China tensions having the CPTPP. So I think it's just a separate issue basically.
Okay, Chris?
Yeah, I don't think it's a silver bullet in any of the issues that we've been discussing. It doesn't mean it's a bad thing. And I'd agree with Doug's probabilities of the likelihood that China or Taiwan join.
And Yele?
I think if we're talking about CPTPP in its current guise, it's not going to address many of the issues because the CPTPP has a very broad national security exception that allows for countries to opt out from their current obligations. So I think China joined in part because it sees that it's not that far off from being able to accede to many of the existing conditions. But that being said, I don't think that countries will allow China into the CPTPP with existing provisions, right? There'll be a separate protocol of accession that will raise the bar much higher. And I think that will be a very, very long road.
Deja vu all over again for the WTO on that front.
Right.
I want to thank our panelists and our audience. This has been an absolutely terrific discussion. Thank you very much, Yele Tan from the University of Oregon, Chris Miller, our colleague at FPRI and from Tufts, and especially Doug Fuller, because he's up at a ridiculous hour from his base at the City University of Hong Kong. Thank you all for a terrific discussion. Thank you all for joining us. I hope you'll join us at future FPRI and Wilson Center events. Good morning, and to Doug, good night.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.